The next 2 to 3 months on Ukraine's front lines before the US presidential elections will be far more brutal than they have ever been. The energy of the confrontation, the number of deaths, the lives lost and the casualties will be more brutal than it was in the last 7 months, even though the previous period was also very brutal. So what lies ahead of us is far worse than we think we know. These are the words of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán in a prediction made in an interview with Axel Springer media outlets, who owns Business Insider. It is likely that it was this concern that has prompted Orbán to make visits to Russia, Ukraine and China in what he described as his attempts to create a limited time ceasefire to speed up peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. He said that he was trying to change what he described as the US war policy and the policy of Europe so that world leaders can converge toward a peace policy.
Mr. Daniel Kovalik.
Good afternoon, dear excellencies. Mr. President, thank you for having me. I am appearing as an executive committee member of the U.S. Peace Council today, and we are very alarmed with what appears to be the creep towards World War III, because you now have President Biden presenting Russia with what is known as the reverse Cuban Missile Crisis, saying that Ukraine can feel free to use Western arms, munitions, missiles to attack Russia deep within its territory. And I think the Security Council has to deal with that to maintain international peace and security and to avert a global conflagration. The next thing I want to talk about, I was shocked that I would have to talk about this, and that is that very shortly, ironically, very shortly after the West celebrated D-Day, the Biden administration announced that it would start arming the Azov Battalion in Ukraine, which is a neo-Nazi organization. How can the West, and the United States in particular, talk about democracy and human rights when it is arming Nazis in Ukraine?
The Anadolu agency reported that Orbán called on the European continent to pursue an autonomous policy from the US because, and I quote, the real victims of the two warring sides are the European economy and the European population. He then reiterated his dire prediction in this quote while recalling on his meetings in Moscow and Kiev. I had the opportunity to talk to both Ukrainian and Russian presidents. Believe me, the next 2 to 3 months will be much more brutal than we thought. Detail of Mr. Orbán's ominous predictions for the next 3 months of the Ukraine war were not elaborated upon, but his tone and choice of words would cause any onlooker to shudder. This war has been described as the biggest and most violent conflict since World War II, and yet the Hungarian Prime Minister thinks the worst is yet to come. Well, why? So today I'm going to explore 2 lesser-known reports on what is expected to occur in the Ukraine war endgame. One from the Embassy of the Russian Federation in the Republic of South Africa, and the other from a Canadian professor, columnist, and former British Army Intelligence Corps officer. Both assessments agree that there is little to no hope for Ukraine, but they come from opposing perspectives, the Russian gaze and the Western realist viewpoint. But both also seems to suggest that the endgame or decisive phase of this Ukraine war is rapidly approaching. Just a year ago, Kiev was preparing for its infamous counteroffensive, while the West, entangled in a labyrinth of lies, was frantically pumping it with weapons. We all know the cost of those illusions, the report from the Russian embassy reads. By October of 2023, in the course of the counteroffensive, Ukraine lost about 125,000 troops and 16,000 units of heavy weaponry. As of 2024, it has become clear even to those who observe the entire picture through the lens of Western propaganda that Russia fully owns the initiative on the battlefield. Not only wasn't Russian defense industry ruined by sanctions, it is steadily growing. Just as our entire economy, 4.6% GDP growth as of January 2024, as the article reports. Kiev, on the other hand, is losing ground. and people, and is about, much to the dismay of Ukrainians, to pass a law tightening mobilization rules. Western media rhetoric has notably changed. They are not speaking about Russian strategic defeat any longer, rather about how not to let Ukraine lose, which is just as delusional. In general, the situation looks drastically different from what the West expected to see, yet very close to what we were seeing from the beginning. In no way shall we lose this conflict, the article reads. Western elites, with their supremacist haughtiness, underestimated Russia as they bet all on our country's military defeat and burnt all bridges behind them. There is a reason the West is clinging on to the Kiev regime, and no, it is not the support of democracy and sovereignty, nor protection of the international law which Russia has allegedly breached. As Polish Prime Minister put it, failure in Ukraine could be the beginning of the end of the golden age of the West. As simple as that. The conflict is not rooted in Russian imperialist ambitions or in the Russian president's alleged warmongering, and it is not, of course, unprovoked and unjustified as the Western media and politicians unanimously try to make you believe. It is about the collective West's dominance being threatened by emerging centers of economic and political power. With this hegemony at stake, the West won't stop supporting the monster in Kiev. As Ukraine kept losing on the battlefield, the West consequently crossed quite a number of its own red lines in arms supplies, javelins, middle and long-range artillery systems, air defense systems such as the Patriot, NASAMS, Abrams tanks, F-16s aircrafts, and etc. However, even some Western experts admit that no F-16s, German Taurus missiles, or any other wonder weapon will let Kiev emerge victorious. It's not for nothing that Western officials and mainstream media frantically push the totally false narrative, trying to convince people that the Ukraine crisis is existential for them. Russia won't stop. Putin is ready to use nukes. Russia will attack NATO in 5 to 8 years, and other tales from the crypt coming soon to frighten Europeans into sending their family members to die for the benefit of global corporations. We want to remind you, the article says, if it were not for the West, Ukraine crisis would not have emerged at all. If not for the West, it wouldn't have gone so far as a special military operation. And finally, if not for the West, the special military operation would have ended back in April of 2022. And here's the final paragraph that mirrors Prime Minister Orbán's prediction. The further the conflict continues, the worse outcome not only for the immediate losing party, i.e. Ukraine, but also for Ukraine's allies it would have. As we previously wrote, it is the West, not Russia, who needs an off-ramp, as this crisis is of its own making. Shall we have to remind them this yet again in even clearer and unambiguous circumstances, let's say by midsummer of this year? It is probably fair to say that nobody has done a very good job of predicting the ups and downs of the war in Ukraine. Initially, analysts overestimated the power of the Russian army, believing that it would quickly defeat Ukraine. When that turned out to be false, they then made the mistake of underestimating Russia, believing Ukraine was bound to triumph. Now the circle is turning again, and a spell of gloom is falling down over the West as it faces the reality that Russia has not collapsed under the weight of sanctions, that the Russian army is showing no signs of disintegration, and that it is Ukraine that seems to be coming worse off in recent battles. The question they now face, therefore, is whether the current gloom is justified or is yet another misperception of reality. The evidence would suggest that the former is possibly more likely than the latter. The military situation today is very different from that of a year ago, when military commentators were confidently predicting that final victory was within Ukraine's grasp. Huge hopes were placed in an offensive operation planned for spring and summer of 2023. Its direction was widely known, too widely known in fact, as it gave the Russians lots of time to prepare. The Ukrainians were to strike southwards in Zaporizhian province in order to reach the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, cutting Crimea off from Russia and isolating it from resupply. Russia, it believed, would then be forced to concede defeat, and Putin might have been ousted from power by disgruntled Russian elites determined to save what they could from the debacle. While some military analysts thought that this objective might be a bit too much for Ukraine, they nonetheless expected the Ukrainians to make some notable advance. Optimism ran high. It continued even when the much advertised offensive ran immediately into major difficulties after it began in early June.
Так вот, Запад ждет результатов контрнаступа. 3 дня контрнаступа. Это то, что видим мы, и то, что я получил информацию от президента России, полностью совпадает. Слушайте, за 3 дня около 3 десятков танков уничтожено, наступающих, украинских. Обороняться проще, чем наступать, вы понимаете. 120 или 130 БМП за 3 дня. И самое страшное, более 2100 погибло украинцев. 2100. С этой стороны чуть больше 70. Вот вам результат этого попытки контрнаступа. Ну, я об этом всегда говорил, что контрнаступ – это большая дезинформация, никакого контрнаступа нет и быть не может, а если, ну, вот результат за 3 дня. И самое главное, 4-й, 5-й день тишина. О чем это говорит? Он потерпели серьезное поражение, сели и думают, а что делать дальше?
The narrative changed. Pundits now argued that capturing territory was not important. What mattered was destroying the enemy's army, and that the Russians were supposedly suffering far greater casualties than the Ukrainians, a claim for which no strong evidence was ever produced. The calculus of attrition favored Ukraine, went the argument. Backed by massive economic power of the West, Ukraine could triumph over the much weaker Russia. It was not to be. By the start of October, the Ukrainian army had abandoned its offensive, having advanced at most about 10 kilometers in a couple of small sectors of the front. The massive stocks of ammunition that had been piled up for the offensive had been expended. Meanwhile, the Russian army, far from losing the attrition battle, had become stronger than before, buoyed by large numbers of new recruits, increased by military-industrial production and weapon supplies from Iran and North Korea. By mid-October, the Russians were attacking along the approximately 1,000-kilometer-long front line. Coming on top the failure of the Ukrainian summer offensive, the capture of Avdiivka had reinforced an increasingly somber mood among pro-Ukrainians, politicians, and commentators in the West. Talk of a Ukrainian victory almost entirely disappeared. Even the most optimistic analysts speak only of Ukraine holding the line in 2024 and possibly going back on the attack in 2025. In conclusion, the article writes that as things stand, the chances of Ukrainian victory now seem very low. What remains less sure is whether Russia has the ability to win such a victory for itself. The next few months are of a decisive importance, as they are likely to determine which of these paths the war is headed. In the meantime, some long and bloody fighting lies ahead. And this article, my friends, was written in February of 2024. Since then, things have become worse for Ukraine, with the loss of Avdiivka, the collapse in Ocheretyn, and the new front in Kharkov. Further, the assumptions which the author made, which he said could, as a best-case scenario for Ukraine and the West, lead to a stalemate, was premised on a successful mobilization and renewed Western aid to Ukraine. The former certainly has not happened to any significant degree, and a question mark remains as to what quantity, if any, of Western weapons have arrived in Ukraine since the $60 billion aid package was declared.
У нас стоять бригади без зброї. У нас стоїть резерви. У нас стоїть 14 бригад неукомплектованих. Які неукомплектовані. У яких немає відповідної зброї, про яку вже голосували, про яку говорили, пакети повинні приходити, але вони йдуть, на жаль, повільно.
Based on Orbán's and the Russian embassy's statements, it seems that Russia intends to turn up the heat as the US election approaches. Remember I said it here first, that Putin may time his blow to end the US hegemony with the US elections in November. We are currently only 4 months away, and we just witnessed an assassination attempt on former President and current Republican candidate Donald Trump, a man who has stated quite clearly that he intends to end the war in Ukraine if elected. Everything seems to be slowly culminating for the November deadline date. Are we, therefore, looking at the most provocative and dangerous time in this Ukraine war, and perhaps geopolitically, in the next few months?
Вертаємося до Дональда Трампа. Через тебе, паскуда, президенту Зеленському не відправляли зброю. Тобі більше не бути президентом. Ти зрадник і заплатиш кров'ю за те, що зробив.
Слава Україні!